Okay. Ooh, I'm green now. Okay. Yes, so it's great to be back with you all again. So we're thinking about the Lord's Prayer, right? And today, that petition, give us this day our daily bread. So what I'm going to do is invite you to reflect on that petition, first in light of the nature of scarcity, a call to prayer amidst scarcity, and then in an exercise of maybe what we might call prayerful imagination. Three themes then evoked by our text: scarcity, prayer, imagination. Now, in politics, in world affairs, in institutions, we might sometimes feel there is a scarcity at work. Scarcity, we might be tempted to think sometimes of wisdom, transparency, compassion, leadership. In our communities, in our families, even in our own hearts, sometimes we might feel there is a certain insufficiency, a smallness, an inadequacy. Certainly, time seems scarce. Scarcity, or the perception of scarcity, can dominate the conversations and the imaginations of the tables we all sit around come Monday morning. Material scarcity, or the fear of material scarcity in our world, might mean a number of things. It might mean limited access to clean water, to clean air, to fuel, to food. And that scarcity, or the perception of scarcity, can feed fear, and it can feed conflict. Material scarcity, along with psychological or socio-psychological factors, are at play in zones of conflict. There may be enough fuel for everyone in the town if everyone continues to use the fuel at the rate they normally use the fuel. But if rumors about scarcities or predicted scarcities spread, this may well result in people taking preventative, radical, maybe even selfish action. Thus, this in turn can lead to the apparent confirmation of what was rumored. It can lead to deeper anxiety, panic, selfish behavior, even conflict. And there's some evidence that in Jesus' time and after Jesus' ministry, material scarcity and debt, especially under an imperial taxation system, caused hardship. By the time we get to AD 66, there is all-out war against Rome. And for sure, we cannot discount material hardship being part of the cause of that conflict. Nor can we assume that feelings and experiences of hardship and scarcity had not been building up for some time. A perception of scarcity, an experience of scarcity, feeding fear, feeding conflict. It works against the promise a people or community have founded their hope on. Certainly, the people felt that under Roman occupation. The blessings, maybe even the presence of God, was absent. The promise of the prophets, envisioning a great return of blessing and the presence of God, seemed in scarce supply. Indeed, the people of God, in a very real sense, felt that they were in exile in their own land. They longed for God to return in blessing and restoration. While exile was over, the promise of the prophets seemed largely unfulfilled. And in the literature that would have composed the backdrop to Jesus' ministry, there was no celebration about the presence of the glory of God in Zion. The promise was yet to be fulfilled. It was in the future. And we hear that particularly in the words and imaginations of prophets like Nehemiah. He speaks about exile at home, where, quote, kings have power over our bodies, our livestock. We are in distress. This, if you like, was a scarcity of promise. Now, communities, of course, form for mutual protection, for prosperity. As groups form, and we might think of groups as local communities, right? Social groups, even states, nations. The formation inevitably leads to boundaried identities. That's to say, certain affiliations or histories or empathies or identities come to include certain people and exclude others. And this notion of a bounded group can eventually lead not simply to thinking of the group as distinct to other groups, but as defined over against other groups. We come to see our group not simply as not them, but we come to see our group defined against what they are, against what they do. Here, ironically, is a sense of community that feeds on the scarcity of deeper community across difference. And that community scarcity can especially happen if there are perceived threats to the boundaries and the boundaried identities, which of course can be quite literal. We might think of border disputes here. But change or the threat to boundaries can also be metaphorical, spiritual, psychological. Rereadings of history or identities that gain more power or voice might challenge the people's identity and the boundaries of what they thought they knew to be true, well-defined, settled. In such circumstances, we find it difficult to see our enemies as part of an underlying or overarching community. There is scarcity of community or community imagination. We find it difficult to see that we belong to a unifying, underlying community despite difference, despite even conflict. So, simple point here is that scarcity in terms of material goods, community, and imagination can create the conditions for fear and even for conflict. A mindset of scarcity does not make for life-giving community and citizenship. And I think there's evidence for this, right? In trouble spots in our world, maybe even in our own discourses, public discourses. Amidst material scarcity, a scarcity of promise, and community scarcity, we, like the disciples, might ask, what do we pray for? Pray, says Jesus, to the Creator, the Sovereign of the world, the Holy One in name and character, and pray God's healing would break in. Pray, says Jesus, Father, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come. Give us each day our daily bread. Give us each day our daily bread. Now, you might not be surprised to learn that in the scholarship there is debate about what this petition for bread means. Have to make a living, right? We might think of the petition as being about material provision, about promise renewed, about community provision. On one level, daily bread simply means the bread pertaining to the coming day. This may be a prayer then, asking God for enough for the rest of the day. It may mean, as with God's gift of manna in the wilderness, enough for today, enough for tomorrow. In praying, give us this day our daily bread, we are praying for enough. For those of us who live amidst plenty, to pray the Lord's Prayer means we're asking God to reorientate our perspective. For the culture we live in, for the lives we lead, for the demands made upon us, enough is a measurement we may feel some alienation from. Give us this day our daily bread. Creator God, give us enough. The culture that we might exist in knows how to measure success to some extent, fame, power, influence, but it may not teach us how to measure enough. And that inability to know enough can drive us very far from contentment and peace of mind and the blessing of God. No wonder then that Mary's song, the Magnificat, that is programmatic for the whole of Luke's gospel, defines the salvation of God as the lifting up of the lowly. But she sings too, God bring down the powerful. To know God is to know enough. To receive this blessing of the returning King means for some a lifting up that they know enough, and for some it is a bringing down that they might know enough. Know maybe that they are enough already. Know that God's regard rests upon them. Give us this day our daily bread. Creator God, give us enough. May we know what enough means. This reading of enough related to material provision and a reorientation to material things already then points beyond this petition being more than simply material provision. It may mean more. This prayer for daily bread may be a prayer for the bread of blessing, the bread of a promised kingdom of God, a kingdom that is even now breaking in Jesus' words and witness. This petition may be about, or may also be about, a desire to see God's promised future provision, salvation, kingdom, deliverance, present here, now. The bread, in other words, can have a more spiritual sense. The prayer is that the promise of the prophets would be fulfilled. God's burning presence and blessing. And this is something that we see in Jesus' ministry. Indeed, at the very beginning of Luke's gospel, Jesus takes on the voice of the prophets to define his own mission. He announces it in his hometown. We know how that went. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to bring good news to the poor, to release captives, to recover sight for the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of Jubilee, to proclaim a new era of salvation, to proclaim the Lord's favor. Jesus, and in Jesus, the promise is being renewed. God is returning to God's people. A new era of salvation dawns. Bread that sustains life, bread that renews promise, might also be about the renewal then of community, because the promise fulfilled is centered on this person, Jesus. So this petition is for God's enduring presence with the disciples. It is a prayer that the bread of life, Jesus Christ, be present and sustain the community. And so for some readers, this entails a Eucharistic allusion here. The food that is necessary for the journey is the grace that comes at the table of the Lord. And that kind of prayer might fit within this manna tradition. It is a prayer to the God who is liberator and sustainer. It is a prayer both for material and spiritual needs, for both, right, are inextricably linked to the renewal of community. To know that what sustains our lives comes from the hand of God is spiritual truth and physical reality. So, however we choose to read this petition, it seems clear that Jesus is teaching us that what sustains us in daily life and what will sustain us in our relationship with God comes from the hand of God, is gift, is grace. So this is not a prayer for human production or productivity. It is a petition to see aright. What we need comes from the hand of God. It is a petition to stand aright. It is God who is the source of our lives, life of our community. The prayer at this point then is a petition and a call to see our lives grounded not in our own striving or productivity, or indeed the scarcities that surround us, but in the abundance of God's gifts, God's grace. We are praying ourselves into a reorientation. And certainly for Jesus as a Jewish teacher, this reorientation is not only future and present focused, it's also grounded in the past. The God of deliverance who brought a people out of oppression is too the God of the wilderness who sent quail and manna. The God who provided daily provision to a pilgrim people. To pray for daily bread is about enough for today. It's about enough for tomorrow. In this kind of manna tradition, it is also about enough defined by God's faithfulness in the past. So the reorientation of the Lord's Prayer is a turning to God, a turning to enough, and it is a reorientation to the history of God's people. We're called to turn to God to know enough, to remember that God has been enough in the past of God's people. And that reorientation as remembrance seems particularly apposite on this weekend, this Sunday. For on this Sunday, we remember both deliverance or liberation and the sustaining presence of blessing. We pray, give us today our daily bread. And in doing so, we are praying ourselves out of a mindset of scarcity. We are praying our way into a deeper realization that our lives are upheld by the grace of the life-giving God. And that realization, if it gets into our bones, saves us either from forgetting God amidst wealth or of unhallowing the name of the Creator in defining ourselves by scarcity. Scarcity and imagined scarcity, along with an inability to measure enough, can lead to fear and to conflict. If such powers can fuel conflict, then the work of peace or reconciliation will mean some kind of reorientation. And that's precisely what the Lord's Prayer calls the church to. Prayer reorientates a community away from defining itself or its mission according to either wealth or want. Instead, we are a community defined by gift. So, in a kind of final move here, I'd like to invite you to think about how a community centered on gift and God's gift of life and grace can be a distinct space, a distinct voice amidst conflict. Prayer in this pace at least, is the renewal of imagination, I'm suggesting. It is, in a sense, more to do with artistry than efficiency. It's not a prayer about or for human productivity. It is, as I've said, about seeing aright. So veteran peace builder John Paul Lederach, with experience in all kinds of conflict zones, makes this very point when he says this, quote, "What if peace building, what if reconciliation were more like a creative, artistic process than a linear formula of cumulative activities aimed at producing a result?" As he thinks about this, he continues, "Intellectual rationality is but one element of the human experience, but it is the element that most wishes to control the others. The artistic process initially breaks beyond what can be rationally understood and then returns to a place of understanding that may analyze, think it through, and attach meaning to it. This is much like the process of reconciliation. Brokenness wanders all over our souls. Healing requires a similar journey of wandering." I often say to my students, the danger of a particular kind of education and the danger of a particular kind of seminary education is that we end up creating clergy functionaries. We teach students to function well, liturgically, biblically, pastorally. And maybe you've had similar experience in your profession. A particular approach to training aims at training colleagues who can function well in the field. And that, of course, is utterly necessary amidst what can feel like a storm of dysfunction sometimes. So please hear me when I say we need professionals who function well in their profession. In a world broken by scarcity and greed, Lederach says we need more. Lederach reviews a number of international movements for peace and justice amidst conflict. He reviews stories of peace building amidst violent conflict in Ghana, Kenya, Colombia, Tajikistan. And each story he reviews is told amidst the potential of hate and violence and the possibility of a different and relational trajectory that he picks up as he reflects in these places of conflict. And he asks the question, what makes the change possible? And as he reflects, he writes this, it was not the techniques used by the mediators or the nature and design of the process. It was not the technical expertise introduced by professional peace builders. It was not the local or national political power, the fears of broader war, the influence and pressure from international community. It was not a particular religious tradition. The stories, in fact, cut across religions. It was not political, economic, military power. What then created a moment, a turning point of such significance in these places? I believe it was the serendipitous appearance of the moral imagination in human affairs. So for Lederach, the key to conflict resolution is imagination. Particularly the key is this concept he homes in on, moral imagination. Now, I don't want to reduce or conflate the one petition in the Lord's Prayer to moral imagination, but I think such prayer does turn us toward this idea of moral imagination. So for Lederach, moral imagination is the, quote, capacity to imagine something rooted in the challenges of the real world, yet capable of giving birth to that which does not yet exist. Give us this day our daily bread. In reference to peace building, he continues, this is the capacity to imagine and generate constructive responses and initiatives that, while rooted in the day-to-day challenges of conflict and violence, transcend and ultimately break the grip of those destructive patterns and cycles. Give us this day our daily bread. Breakthrough and Lederach's experience have not been anticipated outcomes at the end of a rational process or actualized by virtue of the application of a particular technique. Rather, they are, quote, something that approximates the artistic process, imbued as it is with creativity, skill, serendipity, craftsmanship. Give us, O Lord, our daily bread, enough, promise renewed, community revived. So he reviews a large collection of literature and this use of this category, moral imagination. And in the review, he finds 3 attributes for this practice. And my suggestion this morning is this practice of moral imagination echoes to the reorientation we are called to in the Lord's Prayer, and especially that petition, give us today our daily bread. So moral imagination is first perceiving things beyond or at a deeper level than initially meets the eye. In terms of reflecting on our text this morning, this is to celebrate material provision, but it's not to celebrate material provision, but to perceive that provision in ways that are more than material provision. The petition for daily bread is always also linked, in other words, to other needs, other wants, spiritual, psychological, communitarian. Bread, in the case of the Lord's Prayer, speaks to multi-dimensional needs of community. Moral imagination is second, transcending limited or predetermined possibilities. Moral imagination, Lederach writes, quote, breaks out into new territory and refuses to be bound by what existing views of perceived reality suggest. In the context of the Lord's Prayer, we might see here promise renewed. Moral imagination is third, acting creatively that new things come into existence, old things are reshaped, and ways of seeing, hearing, feeling, and thinking are transformed. In the context of Jesus' ministry, we see this in his witness to renew community. So if moral imagination feeds reconciliation and is defined in terms of seeing differently, transcending limited options, and acting creatively, Lederach also identifies conditions that make that imagination possible. These, at least for our purposes this morning, can be summarized in these terms. First, the recognition that we belong to a broader and deeper community that underlies our distinctions and divisions. Lederach writes, time and again, where in small or large ways the shackle of violence are broken, we find a singular taproot that gives life to the moral imagination. The capacity of individuals and communities to imagine themselves in a web of relationships, even with their enemies. Second, the practice of what Lederach calls paradoxical curiosity makes moral imagination possible. And for him, paradox here just means contrary to common belief. Much conflict is based on what we've already called boundaried identities, upon, for example, which of course feed on often historical oversimplifications. the witness of communities for reconciliation, will be a witness beyond then what is commonly accepted. We witness to God's provision and promise through stories that are sometimes complicated, ambiguous, good and bad, tinged by sin and grace. Lederach argues paradoxical curiosity is an act of imagination that, quote, approaches social realities with an abiding respect for complexity, a refusal to fall prey to the pressures of forced dualistic categories of truth, and an inquisitiveness about what may hold together seemingly contradictory social energies in a greater whole. Third, taking the risk of creative action makes moral imagination possible. For Lederach, moral imagination takes form through creative action. Now, he doesn't want to pit social technique and management expertise against one another, but rather he wants to differentiate and connect technique and imagination. Moral imagination makes space for a creative breakthrough or turning point that, quote, moves beyond the grip of conflict. In belief, he writes, quote, that the future is not the slave of the past, and the birth of something new is possible. This, he says, of course, is risky. But this is the work, he says, of peace building. Risk he defines as mystery lived. It is to step into the unknown with no guarantees that there will be success. So, in this kind of sprint through reflection on this petition, where are we left? Fear and conflict are fed by scarcity. We see that in our day, and we see it in Jesus' day. In such circumstances, with the disciples, we might ask, what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to think? How are we supposed to pray? In part, the answer to that question is that we pray to God for daily bread. Amidst scarcity, we are to pray for the daily bread, which we take to mean, yes, material provision, but also community renewal, revival of promise. And that reorientates communities. It is prayerful, imaginative reorientation. And I have suggested, at least, bears some comparison to what peace builders call a renewal of imagination, or the practice of moral imagination. Centering a community on gift, not scarcity, creates opportunity for deeper perceptions of human connectivity and community. It creates opportunity to see beyond limited possibilities. And it creates opportunity for the risk of creative action, witness, ministry. How, Lord, should we pray in these days? Jesus says, pray, Father, hallowed be your name, your kingdom come. Give us each day our daily bread. Thanks, everyone. Okay. Do you want to share this?
I'll just speak loud enough so hopefully it picks it up. I'm just, thank you so much. I'm thinking about practical implications. We're living in a world where we're currently rather aware of certain conflicts, very centered around scarcity. And I was just trying to think of practical examples of where moral imagination and reorienting from scarcity to abundance or enough.
Yeah.
Would change the equation. And I could instantly think of a biblical example of the disciples saying, there's no food here, there's too many people, not enough food, scatter, send away. And Jesus says, no,
Yeah.
imagine
Yeah.
what's in your hand,
Right.
category was just
Right.
the same. Could you think of some modern day examples that would help give us a picture of how this would be fleshed out?
Yeah,
The
so,
idea of moral imagination
yeah.
being implemented?
Yeah, so the first thing, of course, about these like really experienced peace builders is they are not at all romantics, right? In the sense of, well, they are in the sense of like he references poetry and imagination, so there's something about romance there. But I think what you'll find is they'll often say, this happens not very often and always is precarious. But there are breakthroughs, right? But the breakthrough is always limited, is always precarious, right? So you might think about unions in history, right? That distinct identities, even competing ends, unified to create something greater. So let me try and think of examples outside of the context we're thinking in now, but you might think of, for example, right? Common purpose, and maybe even emerging common identity, right? So whether that's in the 18th century, a little bit earlier, a little bit later, you have this move that says there's something underlying our difference that can help us construct common purpose, even common identity. But the great thing about that example, of course, is that is precarious, right? It's a move. It's a constructive move, it's an imaginative move, but it's precarious. And that union is at threat and continues to be at threat. So I think there are examples of that in peace processes, but always we want to say also, there is always the potential for implosion and deconstruction and the return of competing identities that break up community. So, as I say to my students, when you think about happy, fun professor, you always think about me, because they don't. So there's the both, right? There are examples of it, but until the eschaton, right, until the end of the ages, any solution is going to be precarious and not everlasting. It is going to be in danger always. Yeah.
So you, in one of the slides, I saw that you added serendipity in there, and the thing that struck me most was, is that what then makes certain times of the year
Huh.
more open
Huh.
to this kind of reconciliation? And I'm not trying to be the hallmark romantic,
Right.
but it does seem that around the Eastertide for Christians and around the Nativity and going into Advent, there is more of a feeling or a sense that I can move, instead of being at the 49 give line, I can maybe go to the 51 line. Thereby creating
Yeah.
space for that person to come to the 51
Yeah.
where 50 is
Yeah.
the creative moral center. But again, maybe this is more philosophical. What is it about certain times? Like, it was very interesting, you know, the Good Friday Accord
Yeah.
in what in my lifetime was
Yeah.
some of the worst
Yeah.
in Northern Ireland. It seemed like it took Eastertide
Yeah.
to bring the serendipity.
Yeah. It's really interesting comment. That it's a really helpful question. I guess part of my answer is I don't know, but let me talk about my not knowing. It's really interesting. I think there's something there about using cultural resources and readings of histories that can definitely resource movements. And I mean, I think the Good Friday Accords, for example, are pretty complicated because Easter means different things in that context of conflict, right? Like you had an Easter Rising against the British, which was in part to dissolve a union, right? And those nationalist actors precisely organized the rising at Easter, right? They'd thought of the idea of sacrifice in the hope that something new was born. So this was never meant to be, this was kind of, if you like, a theologizing, right? A kind of cultural, religious, spiritual act as well, right? Now there's some controversy about how that can be interpreted, but this was not a full frontal military challenge. They knew this is sacrifice in the hope that something could be reborn. That to say, any cultural resource or religious reference is always unstable, right? It's always unstable. But there's something there that's really interesting, I think, around religious festival, religious imagination, cultural resources, particular moments where hope in culture or religious practice might create some kind of convergence that breaks. Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. And I have done no large-scale research on that, but it's a really interesting question, and I'm sure if we sat here long enough, we could think of other examples, right? Of
Joyeux Noël, the film.
It's really helpful reflection. Yeah.
We think they coincide with seasonal changes.
Ye-
Fall, you start to approach.
Yeah.
You take your clothes out in about March.
Yeah.
Your closets around, you start thinking.
Right.
More.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. Any transition or any moment of transition or connection we can make to hope in these contexts, for sure, have got to be important and potentially resource a shift, resource a different kind of imagination. Yeah, I think it's interesting to think about that. You can hear I haven't really thought about it much. But it's okay.
Next time.
Yeah, next time.
Any other questions?
I'm going to stay with bread
Yeah.
for a bit
Great.
and reverse back to wheat,
Mm.
and then take it back further to the Leviticus model of redistribution.
Yeah.
I'm astonished you got through this whole lecture
Right.
without talking about economics and
Right,
politics.
right.
But good for you.
Yeah.
So we have what I think is a hugely helpful model
Yep.
of not harvesting the edges of your field.
Yep.
So the poor can go without much shame
Yep.
and harvest the field themselves.
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's sort of an
Yeah.
interesting tax policy or
Yeah.
NGO, I don't know.
Yeah.
So if we have a model for wheat and bread, can that model translate to hope or time or other scarcities that you mentioned?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, and you have here, right? You know, Jesus specifically sees himself as bringing the Jubilee, right? Bringing that Levitical promise, right? He says that, and we cited it, right? That the year of the Lord's favor, for sure that's what's going on in the background there. Precisely these practices that you taught. And historians and scholars, of course, argue about to what extent they were ever practiced, but nonetheless, I think it's helpful, and I think it's definitely the imagery is going on there, which, as you say, have specifically economic impact and specific vision about economic practice. Really interesting. Another thing that scholars argue about is the economy of Judea and Galilee at the time of Jesus. And one of the things they argue about is to what extent was scarcity and poverty a reality? And so there are different schools of thought on that. So for example, some will say that Judea, right, the southern part of the country is heavily taxed and heavily colonized, but Galilee in the north will not be really colonized in terms of taxation until much, much later. So Jesus may actually have been coming from a different economic reality as he moves south. I think Jubilee is really interesting, and we have movements and charities that have founded a vision for economic practice precisely on this vision of rest and redistribution and justice, right? There was a big Jubilee movement. If you don't know about that, you can Google it, right? That was about releasing nations even from debt that they've had to pay credit on for decades.
Was
So
that
I
the
think-
Jubilee Manifesto? Was that
yeah,
written
right,
out
exactly.
of that?
So you're absolutely right. I think the idea of Jubilee, the idea of the practices that it suggests, leaving aside whether it happened or not, has inspired folk to campaign for renewed economic practices. Yeah, so I think you exactly put your finger on something that's happening and well worth considering for sure.
Well, can I tease it?
Sure.
But it's back to the model. So
Yep.
how could I think I can come up with a solution. How can I not harvest the edges of my time?
Yeah. The edges of my time. So we're using a spatial metaphor for time, which is
Where
interesting.
time is scarce.
Yeah,
Time being the commodity that you
Right.
can share.
yeah,
Right.
yeah. Are you thinking about something particular yourself, or?
Yeah, I don't have enough time.
Yeah,
I want more time.
yeah,
But
Now, are you talking about saving the edges of your time so that you can somehow give that time
yeah,
to someone else, like volunteering?
yeah, and yeah,
in a charitable act, you tend to use
yeah,
your own resources
Yeah.
efficiently.
yeah. And there's movements now, right? Even in business that you'll know better than me, many of you, where there's this thing now about like not working at 120%, right? What does it look like to work at 90 or 100? And it's precisely looking at this. There's in fact, there's an online course run by an organization called, I knew I'd forget it when I started talking about it. I think it's called, I can't remember, but they're doing this work with business leaders about how to reorientate your concept of time. Yeah, maybe this is something hard, I can't remember. But yeah, I think folk are working, and you know, some of the consultations we do with leaders and organizations is partly this idea, right? That comes from these religious visions about Sabbath, about rest, about creating space and time. And I mean, it's really interesting, your idea of the margins, and yet arguably the biblical pattern is the other way around, right? It's not like you work to the margin after you've got all this stuff done, but it's like there's arguably a sense of a Sabbath practice that you work out of the rest, right? As opposed to the other way around where you work to get the rest, which again is a reorientation. So I think there's really useful resources around that, practical, that organizations are thinking about now. How do we recalibrate, reorientate, not only our calendars, but actually, as you say, even the image and the concept of what we think about in terms of time, right? I think it's really interesting. Yeah, right. Could be, yeah, right. Yeah, exactly, or where you're looking for those spaces, those edges, as you say, those margins. But I wonder is also some of the biblical literature even wanting us to work the other direction, where whatever work we do and service we do is arising out of a deeper sense of rest and Sabbath, right? And that's where in modern, business consultations and stuff, there is this idea about not working to 120%, working from 90%, and what does that look like in an organization? What does it look like in the culture of an organization? What does that look like in terms of how we measure success, right? And the executive that's successful. Well, in many respects, a sign of success is when I ask you, how are you doing? You say to me, I'm busy. Right? That sounds like success, right? And how do you, that's a whole, like businesses and I think that's a whole shift in our culture, to think about time and to organization. I think you can invite colleagues into that. But it's a pretty countercultural move, right? But it's possible, and people are trying to do it, right? When I was doing this with an organization, some of this stuff, the response was, "What? You want us all to become French?" I said, "No, that's not what I'm saying. That's not what I'm saying." There was an advertisement about that, wasn't there? About what? Yeah, car. Yeah.
New Orleans, in New Orleans,
Yeah.
Mardi Gras, carnival season, you work to live. Meaning
Yeah.
you work the amount you need to
Yeah.
get the good life of that season.
Yeah.
And it is a perpetual shift.
Yeah.
And then on Ash Wednesday, there is a transformative, you go back to living to work. And you do work.
Interesting.
And come January 6th again,
Interesting.
you see the shift. Everybody has brighter attitudes. It's okay to take longer lunches, especially if you're at the church's giving. Or it struck me as amazing
Yeah.
when I found going to New Orleans was like going home.
Right.
It felt like I had shifted
Yeah.
my whole
Interesting.
cultural set. It's French.
Yeah.
It's whole
Okay.
and it's-
You're really trying to get me in trouble
out
there, yeah.
of that
Yeah.
American industrial complex
For sure.
set.
Yeah.
They operate differently down there.
Yeah.
There are a lot of Martians.
Yeah. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's a whole lot of, right? There's a whole lot of work done on concepts of time and temporality and how industrialization makes time something that can be commodified and measured. And yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. You've had that microphone for a time, sorry.
Kind of backing up. Very simple concept. Jesus said to pray this way. He also said, "I am the bread of life."
Yeah,
So maybe we just got off track at some point,
yeah,
and we never were talking about food.
yeah, for sure. I think it's helpful, right? Whatever else is happening here, there is a call to center ourselves on this person who's renewing promise and renewing community. Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's follow me, right? Yeah.
In regard to the other discussion, there is a concept that time is meaningless.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I'm not philosophically sophisticated enough to have that conversation, but it's interesting. In intercultural theological conversation, that is part of one of the categories and one of the subjects that scholars talk a fair bit about is this idea of time and how particular theologies assume particular constructs of time that may throw them off track when it comes to reading the New Testament, for example, and promises about the future because of their particular understandings of time. There's a famous African theologian, for example, John Mbiti, who wrote a doctoral thesis at Cambridge University precisely on that time. He looked at his own people, the Akamba, and how they conceived of time and compared it with Western colonial time and Western missionary time. And basically, it's a bit of a spoiler alert here, he basically said colonialist time and missionary time was not traditional time, but if colonialists and missionaries had taken more time to understand how traditional indigenous philosophy approached time, they would read the scriptures better and therefore understand the purposes of God in our lives better. He was doing that in the 1960s. Doesn't seem very controversial today. It was very controversial in 1963 when he was doing the research. So yeah. Interlapping, intersecting issues for sure.
Why don't you talk about time? You never mentioned the astrophysiological time period. Because if you don't even understand what time is and whether time is separate from space or anything else, you could spend forever and just watch everything evaporate, perhaps.
Right. There's a very good reason why I don't talk about that. It's because I'm not qualified to talk about that. But if I'd love to hear a little bit about your sense of how that changes things and how it might lead us down blind alleys, not having that skill and expertise?
Well, what I would say is that the church, to be relevant, ultimately has to have a truthful story.
Yeah.
And to the extent that we don't know what that is,
Yeah.
that's of course difficult.
Yeah.
But it's very rare when you come into church and you hear a discussion
Yeah.
of what is going on with discoveries in the world with
Yeah.
respect to time, space,
Yeah.
and whether there's one universe, multi-universes. And one of the things that I heard a very noted Catholic theologian talk about was simply that that whatever God was a good force, and that he was confident that the good force was out in the universe. But it seems to me that the difficulty of having these specific discussions about time it is simply that if you don't know what it is and what its construct is and what the pieces and parts of it are, it is difficult, I think, to put these things in the Bible in a context that perhaps are meaningful across cultures. I have no idea, for instance, how other religious cultures would look at time.
Yeah.
And the issue really at some point becomes, well, what is it?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting, right? And of course, lots of colleagues who are smarter than me are doing precisely some of this work, right? Religion, science, theology, physics. And again, the tradition. Okay, go for it.
I think one way to think about it is when you compare it to the development of perspective. You know, because slowly we began to understand that there was perspective, and then our understanding of that evolved.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, there are some scholars who are saying that you know, for example, there's resources in the tradition, right, that take a more cosmic view of some of these key theological categories, right, that challenge particular understandings of time. And some of my colleagues who have PhDs in physics and theology, right, are precisely thinking about to what extent discovery and the expansion and the pluralizing of some of these categories can have continuities across cultures and across insights of science. So I think it's a very exciting area. Yeah, and I think the idea of perspective is interesting, isn't it? That we experience time in particular ways in particular cultures. And science will eventually have cultural impact, maybe in terms of how we experience the time. But I think the daily experience is something we can articulate, right? There is a passing away, there is a absenting and presenting, right? But it's fascinating about what like multiple universes do to some theological categories, right? Yeah, and that's where, while it's not a scientist, I am a bit of a science fiction person, so there are some questions that even that raises, right? Yeah, for sure. I'm way beyond my field of competence this morning.
Thank you so much, Robert.
Thank you, everyone.
A fascinating conversation.
Thank you.